When Senator Marco Rubio began speaking about Iran during that live interview, his words were packaged neatly just like many of the sound bites that dominate cable news. He pointed to a series of what he claimed were failures by the Biden administration: the release of billions to Iran, a supposed lack of enforcement on nuclear enrichment, and a weakening of U.S. posture abroad. On the surface, it sounded authoritative, but Jasmine Crockett, seated just feet away, recognized what was happening. Rubio was leaning heavily on talking points, not on facts. And that's where things began to unravel. Rubio framed the return of Iranian funds as a reckless giveaway, implying that the U.S. had gifted money to a hostile regime without oversight. But Crockett didn't allow that mischaracterization to stand. With precision, she reminded the audience that the funds Rubio referred to were not U.S. taxpayer dollars, but rather Iranian assets frozen in foreign accounts. That money had been inaccessible to Iran, under sanctions, until an agreement was reached to release it in exchange for the return of American hostages. And even then, the funds were subject to strict restrictions, able to be used only for humanitarian purposes under international monitoring. This distinction mattered, and Crockett made sure to explain why. The narrative Rubio presented made it seem as though America had lost leverage, but Crockett's fact-based response clarified that diplomacy, not surrender, had been at work. She reframed what Rubio described as weakness as a calculated trade, emphasizing how international agreements and multilateral negotiations often operate behind closed doors, far from the dramatic portrayal that Rubio had offered. Then came the issue of Iran's nuclear program. Rubio claimed that Iran was emboldened and had rapidly accelerated its uranium enrichment. What he didn't say, but Crockett made sure viewers understood, was that this escalation began not under Biden, but after the Trump administration, with Rubio's support, withdrew the U.S. from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, in 2018. That decision, unilateral and without a cohesive replacement strategy, left Iran without the limitations and inspections that had previously kept its nuclear ambitions in check. Rubio positioned the JCPOA's end as a strength, but Crockett flipped that framing by drawing a direct line between the U.S. exit and Iran's return to more aggressive enrichment. She reminded the audience that the deal had been far from perfect, but it was enforceable. Inspectors had been on the ground. There had been transparency. Once the U.S. left, those guardrails vanished. And it wasn't just Iran that changed course, it was also America's credibility that took a hit. This is what happens when politicians rely too much on talking points. They expect people to forget. Rubio, seasoned and well-versed in media appearances, likely didn't expect pushback, not in real time, and not from someone willing to challenge each claim directly. But Crockett didn't offer rebuttals drenched in partisanship. She stuck to the record, and she did so without raising her voice. She pulled apart his narrative piece by piece, exposing the flimsy framework beneath. The repetition of half-truths, suggesting the U.S. gave money to Iran, implying Biden caused nuclear escalation. Ignoring the consequences of abandoning the JCPO was designed to paint a clear political villain. But Crockett didn't let the story stay simple. She brought the complexity back into the conversation. And that's what made her response resonate. In a political landscape where slogans often replace substance, she forced the conversation to return to the facts. Her dismantling of Rubio's arguments wasn't about showmanship. It was about memory, minding both viewers and Rubio himself of what had actually happened, what decisions had been made, and who supported them. By confronting misinformation, Crockett reminded the audience that effective foreign policy discussions demand more than just conviction, they demand accuracy. And when those two things don't align, it becomes glaringly obvious. In the age of viral clips and endless commentary, moments of real accountability on live television are rare. Too often, interviews with public officials become rehearsed exchanges, where politicians deliver memorized lines without challenge, and journalists move quickly to the next question without follow-up. That's why what happened between Jasmine Crockett and Senator Marco Rubio stood out. It wasn't just a disagreement over policy, it was a clear demonstration of how public accountability can break through when someone is willing to challenge misleading narratives as they happen. Senator Rubio, confident and collected, entered the discussion with a familiar strategy: frame the Biden administration as weak on Iran, highlight fears of terrorism, and point to financial transactions as evidence of failed diplomacy. He cited the release of billions in Iranian assets as proof that the U.S. was being taken advantage of. He argued that Iran had grown more aggressive, enriching uranium at faster rates, and thumbing its nose at Western powers. These arguments have been central to Rubio's foreign policy talking points for years. But this time, he was sitting across from someone who wasn't about to let that slide. Jasmine Crockett listened. She didn't immediately interrupt. Instead, she waited for her moment, and when it came, she used it with sharp clarity. She didn't respond with partisan jabs or personal attacks. She responded with facts. She began by questioning Rubio's characterization of the asset release. calmly explaining that these were not U.S. taxpayer funds. These were Iranian funds that had been frozen abroad and later released under very specific conditions tied to the return of detained American citizens. Asterisk, that detail matters. It changes the nature of the deal from a reckless giveaway, as Rubio portrayed it, to a diplomatic negotiation that secured something tangible for the United States, the safe return of hostages. Crockett made it clear that framing this transaction as a loss for America was disingenuous. She acknowledged that diplomacy is complicated, that it rarely offers clean victories, but also emphasized that painting nuanced, negotiated outcomes as outright failures is both misleading and irresponsible. Asterisk, as she spoke, the dynamic in the room shifted. Rubio, who had started with confident declarations, began to appear uneasy. He attempted to interject, but Crockett held firm. She brought the conversation back to context. The escalation of Iran's nuclear program, she explained, was not a recent development under the Biden administration. It had started in 2018 when the U.S. under President Trump with Rubio's vocal support abandoned the JCP, the international agreement designed to limit Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. By walking away from that deal without a clear alternative. Crockett reminded viewers, the U.S. gave Iran the freedom to accelerate its program with far less oversight. That wasn't just a failure of diplomacy, it was a direct result of a policy Rubio had championed. She didn't call it a betrayal, but the implication was clear. The consequences Rubio now decried were at least partially of his own making. Asterisk, this wasn't just a fact check. It was a rare moment when a sitting politician was held accountable. In real time, not after the fact by a think tank or a journalist writing days later, but right there on live television, by a fellow elected official who had done her homework. Asterisk, and viewers noticed. Asterisk, the clip began circulating before the interview. Even concluded, people weren't just impressed by Crockett's command of the facts, they were struck by how calmly and directly she responded. She didn't escalate, she didn't grandstand. She simply told the truth and held her ground. That kind of moment cuts through the noise because it doesn't rely on theatrics, it relies on credibility. Asterisk, Rubio, for his part, didn't have much to say in response. His defense was tepid, and his pivot to other talking points felt forced. He had been expecting the usual safe terrain and opportunity to speak without interruption and to deliver messages designed more for headlines than for dialogue. But Crockett changed the equation. By being prepared and refusing to let misinformation pass unchallenged, she demonstrated how powerful real-time accountability can be. Asterisk, it wasn't just a political win for her. It was a reminder to viewers that live television doesn't have to be theater. It can be a platform for truth if someone's willing to use it that way. Asterisk, Senator Marco Rubio has long positioned himself as a foreign policy authority within the Republican Party, often taking a strong hawkish stance on issues related to Iran. During the live interview in question, he leaned into that image, confidently, asserting that Iran's current nuclear enrichment surge was a direct consequence of the Biden administration's weakness. It was a claim meant to evoke concern, to suggest that Democratic leadership had failed where strong Republican policy might have succeeded. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let that narrative go unchecked. What she did next shifted the entire discussion. Asterisk, she didn't come out swinging. Instead, Crockett took a surgical approach. She reminded viewers that when it comes to Iran's nuclear ambitions, the timeline matters. Rubio wanted to frame the issue as a simple we're better before Biden, and worse after. But Crockett brought the historical context back into focus, particularly highlighting a pivotal decision made during the Trump administration that Rubio supported. The withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. Asterisk, this deal, forged during the Obama years and supported by U.S. allies in Europe, had succeeded in placing strict limits on Iran's nuclear program. It subjected the country to international inspections and created a framework for transparency. While far from perfect, the agreement achieved its central goal. It prevented Iran from advancing its nuclear capabilities beyond a certain threshold. Crockett pointed out that the deal didn't rely on blind trust, it relied on verifiable commitments, monitored by global authorities. Asterisk, but in 2018, the Trump administration unilaterally exited the deal. Rubio, at the time, was one of the most vocal cheerleaders of that decision. He painted it as a bold move that would supposedly bring Iran to its knees. Instead, Crockett said plainly, the exact opposite happened. Once the deal was off the table, so were the inspections and the limitations. Iran was free to resume enriching uranium, and that's precisely what they did. She laid out this timeline clearly, connecting Rubio's past support to the current consequences. Asterisk, this wasn't speculation, it was history, and Crockett used it effectively to dismantle the idea that Iran's current trajectory was solely the result of democratic policy. She argued that if anyone bears responsibility for dismantling the only working framework that had constrained Iran's nuclear program, it was the lawmakers, including Rubio, who pushed to abandon it without offering a viable replacement. Rubio attempted to respond by deflecting, suggesting that the deal had always been flawed, and that Iran couldn't be trusted to honor its terms. Crockett didn't deny that Iran was a challenging and often deceptive actor on the world stage, but she made a key distinction. While no one should blindly trust Iran, the agreement wasn't about trust, it was about verification. It gave the international community a mechanism to monitor Iran's actions. Once that was gone, she explained, so was any realistic way to check Iran's progress. That loss of oversight was a direct result of the policy Rubio backed. What made her point so effective was how she tied Rubio's present-day rhetoric to his own policy record. It's easy for politicians to critique the outcomes of today without taking responsibility for the decisions that shaped them. But Crockett didn't allow that kind of political amnesia. She made sure the audience connected the dots. Rubio wasn't just commenting on the current state of Iran's nuclear program, he had helped create the conditions that led to it. That kind of accountability is rare in live political discussions. Too often, past votes and stances are brushed aside, and officials are allowed to reinvent themselves without consequence. But Crockett forced the conversation to be honest. She wasn't simply saying Rubio was wrong, now she was saying that the consequences he lamented were rooted in choices he proudly supported just a few years ago. And as she laid this out, viewers could see the shift in the conversation. Rubio's confident posture became more defensive. He tried to pivot, to downplay his role, but Crockett had already made the connection clear. She wasn't just debating him, she was reminding the public of the cause and effect nature of policy. Decisions have long shadows, and Rubio's support for abandoning the nuclear deal cast one that couldn't be ignored. Tone isn't just about volume, it's about presence, confidence, and the clarity of one's message. In political discourse, especially on live television, tone often determines whether an argument lands or falls flat. That dynamic was on full display when Jasmine Crockett responded to Senator Marco Rubio during their now viral exchange over U.S. policy on Iran. While Rubio adopted a more traditional, assertive posture, delivering lines with urgency, and opted for something far more disarming and ultimately more powerful. A calm, fact-driven tone that sliced through rhetoric without ever sounding hostile. Rubio came in ready to frame the Biden administration's dealings with Iran as not just naive, but dangerous. He cited the unfreezing of Iranian funds, alleged lapses in nuclear oversight, and accused Democratic leaders of emboldening America's adversaries. His voice was firm, his statements delivered with practiced confidence. This wasn't unusual. For Rubio, who's built a political persona around polished media appearances and rapid-fire critiques of foreign policy decisions made by his opponents. But then came Crockett's turn to speak, and she immediately shifted the energy in the room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't use dramatic language or exaggerated hand gestures. Instead, she laid out her response with composure. She acknowledged Rubio's concerns but then methodically unpacked each one with facts, context, and a deliberate cadence that made it impossible to dismiss her as reactionary. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was educational, almost surgical. When Rubio claimed that billions had been given to Iran, she calmly corrected him. That wasn't taxpayer money, she explained. Those were Iranian funds, frozen, in overseas accounts, released under strict conditions in exchange for detained Americans. She didn't accuse Rubio of lying outright. She didn't need to. Her tone alone signaled that what he said was misleading, and she gave viewers the information they needed to see that for themselves. That contrast. Rubio's forceful assertions versus Crockett's grounded explanations worked in her favor. While Rubio appeared agitated, the longer the exchange continued, Crockett remained centered. Even when he tried to interrupt her or pivot the conversation, she didn't take the bait. Instead, she kept her voice steady, her language clear, and her facts front and center. That level of control projected authority, not aggression. Tone also plays a vital role in shaping how audiences perceive credibility. When someone yells, they often appear emotional or combative. But when someone speaks plainly and with confidence, especially while dismantling falsehoods, it signals competence. Crockett's approach made her argument feel not just persuasive, but trustworthy. She didn't need to win the argument with volume. She won it with clarity. This wasn't lost on viewers. The clip of the exchange spread quickly, not just because of what was said, but how it was said. People recognized that Crockett had achieved something rare. She called out misrepresentations from a sitting senator, without ever sounding disrespectful or partisan. She didn't use insults. She didn't grandstand. She used tone as a tool to elevate her message above the noise. Rubio, by contrast, seemed less composed as the segment progressed. He leaned harder into his talking points, but they began to sound more rehearsed and less responsive. The more he spoke, the more it became apparent that he wasn't adapting to the conversation. He was repeating the same claims that had just been directly addressed. Crockett's steady tone exposed that in real time, it wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it that made Rubio's stance feel weaker by comparison. Even in moments when Rubio tried to shift focus or recapture control of the narrative, Crockett brought the conversation back to the substance. Her measured tone ensured that her words carried weight. When she mentioned the consequences of abandoning the Iran nuclear deal, another decision Rubio supported, she didn't frame it with personal blame. She let the policy record speak for itself. And her delivery made the truth resonate more than any fiery rebuttal could have. By the end of the exchange, it was clear to many viewers that Crockett had not only countered Rubio's claims but had done so in a way that made his aggressive delivery seem less confident and more defensive. Her calm dismantling of his narrative reminded everyone that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room isn't the loudest, it's the one that stays grounded, focused, and honest. As the segment drew to a close, it became evident that the exchange between Senator Marco Rubio and Representative Jasmine Crockett was more than just a debate. It was a case study in how substance can still triumph over soundbites. In an era where political discourse is often reduced to partisan zingers and carefully crafted media spins, Crockett offered something refreshingly different, a steady, informed, and focused response grounded in facts and context. Her performance wasn't theatrical, it wasn't designed for a highlight reel, yet ironically, that very restraint is what made her rebuttal so impactful, and why it began circulating widely across platforms shortly after it aired. Rubio's approach was familiar. Take a complex issue like Iran, boil it down to a few alarming headlines, and place the blame squarely on the shoulders of the current administration. But what he didn't anticipate was a challenger sitting across from him, who not only understood the policy history but could explain it clearly to a national audience in real time. Crockett's calm and methodical takedown wasn't about scoring points, it was about correcting the record and reminding viewers that leadership requires more than rhetoric. It requires truth, accountability, and a willingness to face complexity rather than reduce it to political slogans. What resonated most wasn't just the content of Crockett's argument, it was her command of tone and timing. She didn't interrupt, shout, or accuse. Instead, she let Rubio speak, waited for his framing to take shape, and then proceeded to deconstruct it piece by piece. She didn't need to say Rubio was misleading people. She let the facts make that case for her. And in doing so, she embodied a style of leadership that is increasingly rare, principled, composed, and unafraid to challenge misinformation without descending into chaos. The broader lesson from this moment goes beyond Rubio and Crockett. It speaks to the kind of public servants voters increasingly seek, those who can rise above the noise, cut through the spin, and speak with clarity and purpose. Crockett didn't rely on theatrics to make her point. She relied on knowledge, and that knowledge, delivered with poise and conviction, shifted the conversation in real time. Rubio may have entered that interview expecting another easy platform to deliver his usual critiques. What he got instead was a reality check-in, a reminder that in politics, confidence without accuracy will only carry a person so far. Viewers didn't just witness a rebuttal. They witnessed a moment of accountability, delivered with grace and precision. And in today's divided political climate, that might be the most